The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago. And by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers. And by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million. Yeah, so the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure, assuming nothing else goes wrong. And there's plenty other competitors to put the bullet in China's head. Yeah, all the way from pre-industrial to post-industrial collapse in 45 years. Sure. Well, there's two things. First of all, of course, is one child. Mao was concerned that they had a young upcoming generation after World War II that was going to eat the country alive. So they went to a 2-child policy, ultimately to a 1-child policy. And that was not loosened until 2015. But by that point, the damage was already done because there was a second factor. Remember, countries that industrialize later can follow the path of those who came before. They can skip some steps. So China was the fastest ever industrialization experience. What the United Kingdom did in 7 generations, the Chinese did in 1. And so they crammed 7 generations of economic growth and development into 1. And that's why their growth rate has been so impressive. But you can only do that once. And now it's behind them. And now they have no children. And they have very few people under age 45. Unchecked population growth is necessarily the way to go. That's not what I'm after here. I mean, you require a balance between children, young workers, and mature workers. If you don't have enough mature workers, you don't have the capital. If you don't have enough young workers, you don't have the consumption. If you don't have the children, you don't have a future. China is already out of those last 2 categories. And so we know where this leads. It leads to 0.
And that is the end of China, which is moving out of the realm of the theoretical and the historic into the here and now. What's going on right now is there are protests involving thousands of people against the government that are at least nominally about COVID restrictions. Now, ostensibly, there have been 2 triggers for these sort of mass semi-coordinated protests. The first was a fire that occurred in the western city of Urumqi that killed people who were under COVID quarantine. According to Chinese laws, when it comes to quarantine, people can't move, and it doesn't matter if your building's on fire. And it also meant that the fire service couldn't get into the building to do battle with the fire. Anyway, it's policy in China to weld people into their homes, into their buildings when they're under quarantine, so toss in a fire and shrug. Second, the World Cup. China is an information state, and part of that means that the state lies to you about anything it finds inconvenient, like the fact that most of the world has found a way to move on from COVID. Well, the World Cup's live broadcast showed tens of thousands of cheering and booing fans without masks. And, well, folks got cheesed off. So we now have protests in every major city. The overall number is at least in the high tens of thousands of people participating. And it's difficult to know more detail than that because it's an information state. China is a bit of a black box for policy because China is a one-man state, but that one-man state is becoming overwhelmed with non-compliance. And the government just doesn't have the bandwidth to come up with policies that most people would consider normal. But I think the best word we can use here is creative. One person only has so much bandwidth. And so we're seeing institutional freezing and breakdown because this isn't the United States where a bunch of suburban housewives descend maskless on a food court and start yelling, "Let's go, Brandon," or a few yahoos glue themselves to a museum wall. We can obviously get through crap like that, but it isn't clear that China can. It has to do with a different structure. The United States has different levels of authority: local, state, national, legislative, judicial, executive, neighborhood, business, academic, and so on. Independently garnered, constitutionally garnered, community created, overlapping, sometimes clashing, often messy. But interests generate power, generates authority, generates durability. Not in China. China is a one-man state because it is nearly the only way that China can exist. This isn't Sweden or Denmark or France or Argentina or Korea, where the bulk of economic and political power exists in one city, so it's easy to come to a degree of consensus. China's population is spread out on a huge swath of territory comprising everything from near Arctic to fully tropical, and regional disparities abound as you would expect. But this also isn't the United States, where our definition of inequality means that the average person in Maryland is about twice as wealthy as an average person in West Virginia. China's regional disparities are a 10-to-1 span. Nor is this a country like Germany or the US or Japan or India or Indonesia, where geography was kind enough to enable physical integration via either waterways or easily maintained road and rail networks. And so where you have integration, you have commonality. You've never had that in China. The North China Plain is its own region. The Yangtze Basin is an industrial powerhouse with few connections to the north. And the cities of the southern coast have always looked abroad for their welfare, their safety, and even their food. The only way to make China work is to force it to. And these many disconnects show up in Chinese institutions. The Chinese constitution is a joke. It isn't even referenced by Chinese courts. There's no rule of law. There is law by rule. And that rule is whatever Xi, the chairman, says. And he is a horrible delegator, even within the Chinese Communist Party. The COVID restrictions in play right now are part of that milieu. They all draw their authority and power not so much from the Communist Party or the Chinese state, but from Xi personally. That's how you get neighborhood HOAs enforcing COVID lockdowns so brutal that fire escapes are welded shut to ensure enforcement, ensuring that people die in easily preventable tragedies like what happened in Urumqi. Or city authorities thinking that they're doing the will of Xi and removing street signs with the word Urumqi in them because they assume that's what Xi wants in order to smother citizen awareness. If we see meaningful resistance to any Chinese policy, China goes one of two directions. Option one, you get a rolling series of government breakdowns as Xi's authority is challenged, and there's no one to step in to replace it because he has purged the system so completely. COVID is only one Chinese policy that feels a bit out of place. What about the social monitoring system that has created an information state tighter than Cold War East Germany? What about lending controls that have contributed to real estate distortions 2 orders of magnitude larger than America's subprime? What about laws against the VPNs that allow you to share your kids' photos without them being entered into a national database? What about the deliberate cultural destruction policies for the Uyghurs and Tibetans? A crack in Xi's personal authority isn't simply a crack in the facade, but a fissure to the core which would unleash a torrent of dissent that would wash away everything. We're already seeing the protests spread to non-related issues. University students are getting in on it. Opinions are being aired on dictatorship versus democracy, economic growth, housing, how good or how bad a job Xi personally is doing. In a country where any sort of common coordinated public outcry is viewed as treason, we are already hip deep. Or there's always option B. Xi puts a stop to it. Xi is a child of the Cultural Revolution, a 10-year-long internal repression so intense it killed at least 40 million people and gutted what then passed for the Chinese economy. Neither of these are great options, but both of them are emblematic of the long run of Chinese history. Either China becomes too tightly wound and controlled and it descends into an orgy of self-destruction, or central authority breaks and China spins apart in an orgy of self-destruction. And just in case you haven't been paying attention, neither of these outcomes are particularly good for business. We're now at a point where it's not so much that if you wanted to divest away from China, it's too late to do so in a way that enables you to salvage your facility. We probably passed that point over the summer. Now the issue is that if you lack an evacuation plan for your key employees, you might not be able to get them out at all. And just so no one overlooks the other issue, China's domestically generated COVID vaccines don't work against Omicron. And previous lockdowns within China have kept COVID out of the general population, so very few Chinese have any natural resistance.